Let's review a really important skill for the section on quadratic functions called completing the square. The reason completing the square is such an important skill is that it allows you to take a quadratic in standard form, like we have here, and convert it into a form that allows you to easily see its maximum or minimum value. So watch as I complete the square on this quadratic function, and then I'll get you to try one over here later using the same steps I show you. The first step is to look at the very first term, and if it has a number in front, in this case it does, it's the number 3, then I have to common factor it from the first two terms. If there's no number there, I can just skip step 1. Okay, I'm going to common factor out that 3, and I'll be left with y equals 3, and then I'll have a bracket, x squared plus 4x. And remember, I'm just doing the first two terms, so the minus 8 stays by itself where it is. The next step, I need to look at this 4 inside the bracket, and I'm going to cut it in half, or in effect divide it by 2, which will make 2. 4 divided by 2 is 2. Then I square that number, which will give me 4, and I'll write it like this. Y equals 3. I more or less keep everything the same as I had in step 2, plus 4x. Then I write plus 4 and minus 4 inside the bracket. So I took this number, divided it by 2, then squared that number, and I got 4, plus 4 and minus 4. And I keep the minus 8 at the end. The next step, I'm going to look at this minus 4, whatever number happens to be right here when you do it, and you are going to multiply it by the number in front, if there is one. So 3 times negative 4 makes negative 12. Then I'm going to move it outside the bracket to have this. Everything stays the same so far. I keep the plus 4 right where it is, and I close the bracket. Now I have my minus 12. I've just moved it outside the bracket. So don't forget to multiply this number by whatever number is in front before you bring it outside the bracket. The next step is more or less a little bit of cleanup, but it's a very important number, and we'll see why in just a second. I'm just going to rewrite what I have here, but the two numbers that are now outside the bracket I'm going to put together. So negative 12 and negative 8, in this case, will make negative 20. Finally, I have a quadratic here inside of a bracket. It turns out to be a special kind of quadratic. It's a perfect square. And I can show that. I can simplify this by taking the square root of the number at the end. Let me show you what I mean. I'll rewrite y equals 3. Now to simplify this, I'll take the square root of the x squared term, which is just x. I will ignore the middle term, and I'll just take the square root of this term, which is 2. The square root of 4 is 2. X plus 2. And then finally, I just need to add a little squared exponent right there to simplify that quadratic. And then I just keep the minus 20 by itself as it was. And now I'm finished. That's how you complete the square on a quadratic equation. Now this nice new form is pretty important. It tells me some interesting things. For example, I can tell that this is a quadratic that opens upwards. And that's because the number in front, the 3, is positive. If it were negative, my quadratic would open downwards. I also know that the minimum value for this quadratic is right here on the end. It's minus 20. So completing the square is definitely a very handy tool to have in your quadratic function toolbox. And now let's give you some practice with completing the square. Here's your quadratic in standard form. Y equals 2x squared plus 8x minus 7. So go ahead and try the steps I've showed you on the left, but just sub in the numbers that you have to work with. All right, so go ahead and try that one now. Your answer is y equals 2, and in brackets, x plus 2 all squared minus 15. And if you didn't get that, review the steps right here and see where you went wrong.